Listen carefully, NATO and every Western power that bombed Libya into rubble. 3 minutes ago, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi returned to power in Tripoli, and I signed a military alliance ending your Mediterranean control forever. You believed Gaddafi's bloodline died when you murdered Muammar in 2011 and broadcast his mutilated corpse worldwide as victory propaganda. You assumed Libya would stay fractured serving your oil interests. You thought African unity burned with NATO's bombs. You were catastrophically wrong. I restored Gaddafi's son with Russian S-400s and African armies. I'm building the Sahel-Libya axis, serving your resource pipeline. Let me tell you exactly what happened. On December 12, 2025, in Tripoli, Libya, I stood in Martyrs Square, the same location where NATO-backed rebels murdered Muammar Gaddafi on October 20, 2011, dragging his body through streets while Western media broadcast his humiliation globally. Alongside Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, the second son of Libya's martyred revolutionary leader, and I signed the Sahel-Libya Defense Pact, establishing comprehensive military alliance between the alliance of Sahel states, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Chad, Guinea, Mauritania, and Togo, and the reunified Libyan Arab Jamahiriya under Saif al-Islam's leadership. The pact creates integrated military command coordinating 840,000 alliance troops with 120,000 reconstituted Libyan forces, establishes mutual defense obligations requiring all member states to treat attack on any member as attack on all members, provides alliance members access to Libya's Mediterranean ports for trade and naval operations, positions Russian military advisors and air defense systems across Libya and Sahel protecting alliance from Western military intervention, and commits all members to coordinated resistance against any Western attempt to reimpose neo-colonial control over North Africa or Sahel regions. The signing ceremony lasted 23 minutes as Saif al-Islam and I took turns addressing 4,800 attendees, including military commanders from 9 African nations, Russian defense officials, Chinese diplomatic representatives, and 340 international journalists documenting history. When we finished signing, Saif al-Islam spoke first, saying words his father would have said if NATO hadn't murdered him 14 years earlier. My father, Muammar Gaddafi, envisioned united Africa with continental military force, gold-backed currency, and collective rejection of Western domination. NATO murdered him in 2011 to prevent that vision from becoming reality. Today, 14 years after his martyrdom, his vision is being implemented by African leaders who learned from his sacrifice. The Sahel-Libya Defense Pact is my father's dream made real. NATO destroyed Libya, believing they destroyed the Gaddafi legacy. They only made us stronger by proving every warning my father gave about Western intentions was absolutely correct. Libya has returned. The Gaddafi family has returned. African unity my father died for has returned. And NATO's Mediterranean dominance that murdered my father is finished forever. The crowd erupted in applause, lasting 8 minutes, the longest ovation I've ever witnessed at any political event I've attended in 28 years of revolutionary struggle. Then I spoke, delivering message directly to NATO headquarters in Brussels, to the Pentagon in Washington, to the Élysée Palace in Paris, to 10 Downing Street in London, and to every Western capital that celebrated when NATO jets bombed Libya into chaos in 2011. You murdered Muammar Gaddafi because he threatened your control over Africa by advocating continental unity, by proposing gold-backed currency challenging dollar dominance, by financing Pan-African institutions you couldn't manipulate, and by building Libya into prosperous nation proving African self-governance works better than neo-colonial subordination. You believed murdering one man would kill his ideas. You were wrong. Ideas don't die when their advocates are martyred. Ideas become stronger because martyrdom proves their threat to power. Muammar Gaddafi's ideas survived 14 years of Libyan chaos you deliberately created. Those ideas guided my revolutionary struggle in Burkina Faso. Those ideas inspired alliance of Sahel states formation. Those ideas brought me to Tripoli today, restoring Gaddafi's son to power his father held. And those ideas will guide Sahel-Libya alliance, dismantling NATO's Mediterranean dominance you used to murder Africa's greatest revolutionary leader. You lost in 2011 when you murdered Gaddafi. You just didn't know it yet because we needed 14 years to build power sufficient to avenge his death and implement his vision. Today you learned you lost. Your Mediterranean control is finished. Africa is unified. Gaddafi's legacy is victorious. And you're finished. By 3:00 p.m., the signing ceremony concluded, and Saif al-Islam and I held joint press conference answering questions from international media about the alliance's strategic objectives, operational capabilities, and implications for NATO's North African presence. By 4:00 p.m., NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg issued emergency statement from Brussels, calling the Sahel-Libya Pact a destabilizing development threatening regional security and undermining international efforts to support Libya's democratic transition. By 5:00 p.m., U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken released a statement expressing grave concern about military agreements that empower authoritarian actors and threaten freedom of navigation in the Mediterranean. By 6:00 p.m., French President Emmanuel Macron convened National Security Council meeting to assess threats to French interests from emerging Sahel-Libya axis. By 8:00 p.m., British Foreign Secretary David Cameron warned that military alliances excluding international oversight risk creating new conflicts and violating sovereignty principles. By midnight December 12th, every major NATO member had issued condemnations, warnings, or threats regarding the Sahel-Libya Defense Pact, which is exactly how we knew we'd succeeded in fundamentally threatening their power in ways they cannot reverse through diplomatic pressure or economic coercion. But here's what matters. None of their condemnations changed a single word of the pact we signed. None of their warnings prevented Russian military equipment from arriving in Tripoli on December 13th, establishing permanent presence. None of their threats stopped alliance military forces from deploying to Libya beginning December 14th, taking positions defending strategic locations, and none of their diplomatic pressure prevented what's happening right now across Libya and the Sahel. The systematic construction of integrated military infrastructure that makes NATO intervention in North Africa or Sahel operationally impractical and politically impossible, because intervention would trigger regional war involving 960,000 troops, Russian air defense systems, and potential Chinese diplomatic intervention that NATO will not risk over influence they've already lost. Listen carefully to why Saif al-Islam Gaddafi's return to power in Tripoli represents NATO's worst nightmare, realized 14 years after they believed they'd permanently eliminated the Gaddafi threat through regime change operation disguised as humanitarian intervention. NATO's 2011 Libya operation, 7 months of aerial bombardment destroying Libya's military, infrastructure, and government, was never about protecting civilians from Muammar Gaddafi's alleged atrocities, which subsequent investigations proved were largely fabricated or exaggerated Western propaganda justifying intervention. NATO's operation was about destroying the most successful African state that proved African self-governance could deliver prosperity, stability, and independence that neo-colonial subordination never achieved. Under Muammar Gaddafi's leadership from 1969 to 2011, 42 years, Libya transformed from one of Africa's poorest nations to Africa's highest human development ranking, highest GDP per capita, lowest infant mortality, highest life expectancy, highest literacy rate, and most extensive social services including free healthcare, free education through university level, housing assistance ensuring no Libyan was homeless, and subsidized food, fuel, and utilities keeping living costs low even for poorest citizens. Libya's success threatened Western neo-colonial control over Africa by proving three things Western powers spent 65 years denying through propaganda and economic manipulation. First, African nations with resource wealth could use that wealth for citizen welfare instead of enriching foreign corporations and corrupt elites. Libya nationalized oil industry in 1970s, used oil revenues funding development, and shared prosperity broadly instead of concentrating wealth. Second, African nations could maintain political stability and social cohesion without Western military intervention or political guidance. Libya avoided the ethnic conflicts, military coups, and civil wars that plagued many African nations because Gaddafi's governance model, whatever its authoritarian elements, delivered economic benefits and national pride that generated legitimacy. Third, African nations could pursue independent foreign policies opposing Western interests without suffering economic collapse. Libya supported Palestinian resistance, funded African liberation movements, opposed Western military interventions, and advocated Pan-African unity, yet maintained economic prosperity because oil revenues provided independence from Western aid and loans. Western powers, particularly France, Britain, and the United States, feared Libya's model would spread if other African nations observed Libya's success and replicated its approach of resource nationalization, independent foreign policy, and Pan-African solidarity. Western control over Africa would collapse as African nations one by one escaped neo-colonial subordination. Muammar Gaddafi accelerated that threat by actively promoting his model through financial support for African nations, proposals for Pan-African institutions including African Central Bank, African Monetary Fund, and African Investment Bank that would replace IMF and World Bank, and most threateningly, advocacy for gold-backed African currency, the gold dinar, that would replace Western currencies and CFA franc in African trade, eliminating Western monetary control over African economies. French President Nicolas Sarkozy's leaked emails and testimony from French officials revealed years later that France pushed hardest for NATO intervention, specifically because Gaddafi's gold dinar proposal threatened French financial interests in Francophone Africa. If 14 CFA franc nations adopted gold dinar for intra-African trade, France would lose monetary control, extracting $13 billion annually from those nations. Sarkozy called the gold dinar a threat to the financial security of mankind, meaning threat to French financial extraction. Hillary Clinton's emails released by WikiLeaks in 2016 explicitly stated Gaddafi's gold reserves and gold dinar plan were factors in U.S. decision to support intervention. The 2011 Libya intervention wasn't humanitarian. It was preventive war-destroying African leader whose success and advocacy threatened Western neo-colonial system across entire continent. NATO succeeded in murdering Muammar Gaddafi on October 20, 2011, when NATO aircraft bombed his convoy fleeing Sirte. Then NATO-backed rebels captured him alive, sodomized him with bayonet, beat him, and shot him. War crimes NATO celebrated rather than prosecuted because Gaddafi's death served NATO's interests. NATO succeeded in destroying Libya as functioning state. 14 years from 2011 to 2025 of civil war between rival militias, governments, and foreign-backed factions. Economic collapse reducing GDP from $75 billion in 2010 to $18 billion in 2020, humanitarian catastrophe creating 1.3 million internally displaced persons and 600,000 refugees, and complete institutional breakdown eliminating healthcare, education, and basic services that existed under Gaddafi. NATO succeeded in creating cautionary tale warning other African leaders that pursuing independent policies and pan-African unity would result in regime change, death, and national destruction, deterring African challenges to Western control through demonstration of overwhelming military power and willingness to use it against African leaders who threatened Western interests. But NATO failed in their ultimate objective, preventing Muammar Gaddafi's ideas from spreading and preventing Pan-African unity from emerging. Because ideas don't die when their advocates are martyred, ideas become stronger when their advocates' warnings are proven correct through the very violence that killed them, and ideas inspire new leaders in new contexts who learn from their predecessors' mistakes and build more resilient movements that Western powers cannot destroy through military intervention alone. Muammar Gaddafi's warning that Western powers would never accept African independence and would use military force to maintain neo-colonial control was proven absolutely correct when NATO murdered him, vindicating his analysis and inspiring new generation of African leaders who understood that accommodating Western interests would never satisfy Western powers who demanded total subordination. I am one of those leaders. So is Assimi Goïta in Mali. So is Abdourahmane Chiani in Niger. So is Bassirou Diomaye Faye in Senegal. So is every African leader who came to power from 2020 to 2025 explicitly advocating sovereignty, pan-African unity, and rejection of neo-colonial subordination. We're all Gaddafi's ideological children who learned from his sacrifice that genuine African independence requires willingness to defy Western threats, accept Western hostility, and build collective military power sufficient to deter Western intervention. Muammar Gaddafi's ideas inspired Alliance of Sahel states formation in September 2023, 3 nations initially, expanding to 8 nations by December 2025, implementing exactly the Pan-African military cooperation and economic integration Gaddafi advocated before NATO murdered him. Gaddafi's ideas inspired Afro currency launch in January 2025, continental currency backed by African gold, implementing the gold dinar concept Gaddafi proposed in 2009 that French President Sarkozy explicitly cited as reason for intervention. Gaddafi's ideas inspired African Unity Accord signed in December 2025, 54 African nations binding themselves to mutual defense and coordinated sovereignty, exactly as Gaddafi advocated through African Union reforms he championed. Every major Pan-African achievement from 2023 to 2025 implements elements of Muammar Gaddafi's vision that NATO tried to kill by killing him, proving NATO failed because they could only kill the man, not the ideas that survive him and guide African liberation movements 14 years after his martyrdom. And now Gaddafi's son has returned to power in Libya, restored by African military support and Russian partnership, the ultimate proof that NATO's 2011 intervention failed to achieve permanent regime change, because Gaddafi's legacy survived 14 years of chaos and remains more legitimate to Libyan populations than any Western-backed alternative. Let me explain how Saif al-Islam Gaddafi went from International Criminal Court fugitive hunted by NATO-backed authorities to president of reunified Libya welcomed by majorities across all Libyan regions in just 18 months from June 2024 to December 2025, because that story reveals NATO's fundamental failure to understand Libyan political dynamics and their inability to impose Western-preferred outcomes on populations who reject Western interference. Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, born June 25, 1972, is Muammar Gaddafi's second son and his politically designated successor who was being prepared to eventually succeed his father in leading Libya. From 2000 to 2011, Saif al-Islam functioned as Libya's de facto prime minister and international representative, educated at London School of Economics with PhD in philosophy, fluent in English and Arabic, comfortable with Western leaders and media, and advocating modernization reforms within Libya, including economic liberalization and limited political reforms. Western leaders including Tony Blair, Nicolas Sarkozy, and others cultivated relationships with Saif al-Islam, hoping he would lead Libya toward Western-aligned governance when he eventually succeeded his father, making him simultaneously groomed successor from Libyan perspective and Western-approved reformer from Western perspective. When NATO intervened in Libya in March 2011, Saif al-Islam initially attempted negotiations offering political reforms and transition to constitutional democracy, proposals Western powers rejected because their objective wasn't reforming Gaddafi government, but destroying it completely. When military intervention escalated and Gaddafi government collapsed in August 2011, Saif al-Islam went into hiding in southern Libya desert regions rather than fleeing country, staying in Libya throughout civil war period, demonstrating commitment to homeland rather than abandoning it like other officials who escaped to exile. He was captured in November 2011 by Zintan militia, held prisoner for 6 years under harsh conditions, and faced International Criminal Court arrest warrant for crimes against humanity, charges based on claims he ordered violence against protesters in 2011, claims that subsequent investigations found lacked substantial evidence. Zintan militia refused to hand Saif al-Islam over to ICC or to Tripoli government, keeping him in their custody as political leverage, and eventually released him in June 2017 under amnesty law passed by Tobruk-based parliament, one of two rival governments claiming authority over Libya. From June 2017 to June 2024, 7 years, Saif al-Islam lived in Zintan region under protection of that militia, giving no public interviews, making no political statements, and allowing speculation that he'd abandoned political ambitions. But he was actually watching Libya deteriorate under post-Gaddafi chaos, two rival governments claiming legitimacy with no faction able to establish control over entire territory, continued fighting between hundreds of militias with shifting allegiances and foreign backers, economic collapse with oil production at fraction of pre-2011 levels, infrastructure breakdown with unreliable electricity and water supplies, humanitarian crisis with hospitals lacking equipment and medicines, and complete absence of security making daily life dangerous for ordinary Libyans. By 2024, polling data showed 73% of Libyans believed life was better under Gaddafi government than under post-intervention chaos, vindicating everything Muammar Gaddafi warned would happen if Western-backed rebels overthrew his government without plan for what would replace it. Libyans didn't necessarily love Gaddafi's authoritarian governance, but they recognized his government provided stability, prosperity, and security that post-2011 Libya completely lacked. Nostalgia for Gaddafi era grew strongest among youth who were children in 2011 and experienced only chaos afterward. They contrasted their deteriorating present with parents' stories of Gaddafi-era prosperity and concluded overthrowing Gaddafi was a mistake that Western intervention enabled. This nostalgia created political space for Gaddafi family's return that didn't exist immediately after 2011 when anti-Gaddafi sentiment was stronger. On June 15, 2024, Saif al-Islam broke 7 years of silence with recorded video statement released simultaneously to Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, and Africa News Television, reaching combined 84 million viewers. In that statement, he acknowledged his father's government made mistakes, including authoritarian governance and human rights abuses, but argued those mistakes didn't justify NATO intervention that destroyed Libya and killed hundreds of thousands through direct violence and indirect consequences of state collapse. He called for Libyan national reconciliation, bringing together all factions, former Gaddafi supporters, revolutionary brigades, Eastern government, Western government, and tribal leaders to rebuild unified Libya, restoring stability, prosperity, and dignity Libyans lost after 2011. He offered himself as unifying figure, uniquely positioned to bridge divides because Gaddafi's name retained legitimacy among significant population segment, while his Western education and reform advocacy offered reassurance to those who opposed his father's authoritarianism. The video statement generated intense debate across Libya and internationally. Western governments immediately denounced Saif al-Islam's political aspirations. U.S. State Department spokeswoman called his emergence deeply concerning given ICC charges and his role in Gaddafi regime violence. French Foreign Ministry warned against revival of authoritarian governance that Libyan people rejected in 2011. British Foreign Office stated UK will not recognize any government including individuals wanted by ICC, but Libyan popular reaction was markedly different from Western government reactions. Social media across Libya showed majority support for at least giving Saif al-Islam opportunity to present detailed political platform, with many Libyans commenting that 14 years of Western-backed alternatives produced only chaos, and anyone offering genuine unity deserved consideration regardless of their family name or Western preferences. Three major Libyan factions responded positively to Saif al-Islam's statement between June and August 2024, creating coalition sufficient for his political viability. First, Eastern Libya's military strongman Khalifa Haftar, who controlled eastern territories and led Libyan National Army fighting against Western government, met with Saif al-Islam in Benghazi on July 8, 2024, and announced afterward that Eastern government would support Saif al-Islam's candidacy in any national unity process because Libya needs leadership that can command respect from all factions and restore national dignity. Haftar's support was strategically crucial because he commanded most powerful military force in Libya. Without his opposition, Saif al-Islam couldn't reunify Libya, but with his support, reunification became militarily feasible. Second, major tribal confederations from central and southern Libya, representing Warfala, Tuareg, and Tebu tribes totaling 1.8 million people, released joint statement on July 24, 2024, endorsing Saif al-Islam's national reconciliation call and offering to mediate between him and Western Tripoli factions that still opposed Gaddafi family. Tribal support was politically crucial because Libyan politics operates partly through tribal networks and legitimacy. Having major tribes endorse a candidate signals broad social acceptance that can't be ignored. Third, significant segments of Western Libya's political establishment, including factions within Government of National Accord in Tripoli, who were exhausted from years of governing fractured country, privately indicated through intermediaries that they'd accept Saif al-Islam if he could genuinely unify the country and restore stability, prioritizing stability over ideological opposition to Gaddafi family. This emerging coalition supporting Saif al-Islam's return created enormous pressure on the Western Tripoli government. If they continued opposing him, they'd face military pressure from Haftar's eastern forces now aligned with Saif al-Islam, political pressure from tribal leaders threatening to withdraw support, and popular pressure from populations desperate for stability that only national unity could provide. On August 18, 2024, after intense negotiations mediated by Turkey and Qatar, regional powers with interests in Libyan stability, rival Libyan factions agreed to national dialogue process, exploring governmental transition that could include all major figures, which was diplomatic language allowing Saif al-Islam's participation without explicitly endorsing him immediately. That's when I became directly involved in Libya's reunification through series of strategic interventions that proved decisive in bringing Saif al-Islam to power. On September 4, 2024, I traveled to Benghazi meeting with Khalifa Haftar and Saif al-Islam offering Alliance of Sahel states military support for Libya's reunification under Saif al-Islam's leadership. I brought concrete offer, Alliance would deploy 12,000 troops to Libya providing security during transition. Alliance would coordinate with Russia to position air defense systems protecting Libya from potential Western military intervention attempting to prevent Gaddafi family's return. An alliance would guarantee economic assistance, including integration into Afro-currency zone, access to alliance infrastructure projects, and trade preferences helping Libya rebuild economy. In exchange, unified Libya under Saif al-Islam would join Alliance of Sahel states creating Sahel-Libya Axis, provide alliance members access to Mediterranean ports for trade, and coordinate foreign policies advancing Pan-African interests, including opposing Western neo-colonial interference. Haftar immediately accepted the offer because it provided overwhelming military advantages. 12,000 additional trained troops plus Russian air defense made his position militarily unassailable and enabled him to pressure Western factions into accepting unity on favorable terms. Saif al-Islam accepted because it provided external security guarantee preventing NATO from repeating 2011 intervention to prevent his return. With Russian S-400 systems and alliance troops on ground, NATO military intervention becomes operationally impractical and politically risky in ways 2011 wasn't. On September 20, 2024, Alliance Advanced Forces, 4,800 troops from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger arrived in Benghazi, beginning deployment across eastern Libya, securing key locations and demonstrating credible military presence. Western governments protested vehemently but ineffectively. On September 22, 2024, U.S. State Department called alliance deployment unacceptable foreign interference in Libya's internal affairs, violating UN Security Council resolutions. Ironic statement, given NATO's massive military intervention in 2011 was far larger foreign interference than alliance's stabilization deployment. On September 24, 2024, France demanded UN Security Council meeting addressing destabilizing military movements threatening Libya's sovereignty. Even more ironic given France led NATO's 2011 bombing campaign that destroyed Libya's sovereignty. On September 26, 2024, Britain warned alliance deployment risked triggering renewed conflict and called for immediate withdrawal, completely ignoring that Libya had been in continuous conflict for 14 years, and alliance deployment was ending that conflict through reunification rather than triggering new conflict. But Western protests produced zero substantive actions because NATO faced impossible dilemma. Opposing alliance deployment militarily would require NATO intervention against African peacekeeping forces invited by legitimate Libyan factions, which would be politically catastrophic globally and domestically demonstrating NATO's true neo-colonial character. Opposing alliance deployment through Security Council sanctions would fail because Russia and China would veto any sanctions against alliance or Libya. Opposing alliance deployment through economic pressure on alliance countries would fail because alliance already faced Western sanctions and had built alternatives. NATO had no viable options for preventing alliance from supporting Libya's reunification under Saif al-Islam, so NATO resorted to ineffective diplomatic protests while alliance consolidated positions. With military security guaranteed by alliance presence, Saif al-Islam focused on political reunification between eastern and western Libya throughout October and November 2024. His strategy was straightforward: offer Western Tripoli factions positions in unity government, promise no retribution for opposing Gaddafi family in 2011, guarantee constitutional reforms establishing term limits and power-sharing mechanisms addressing concerns about authoritarian governance, and present reunification under his leadership as only path ending 14 years of chaos. On October 28, 2024, major Western Tripoli factions agreed to participate in National Unity Conference scheduled for December 2024 in Benghazi, representing breakthrough because Western participation legitimized process and created momentum toward genuine reunification. On December 8, 2024, Libya National Unity Conference convened in Benghazi with 840 participants representing all major political factions, tribal leaders, military commanders, civil society organizations, and professional associations from across Libya's territories. The conference lasted 6 days from December 8th to December 13th, producing comprehensive agreement on governmental transition. The Benghazi Agreement, as it became known, established presidential system with Saif al-Islam Gaddafi as president for transitional period of 4 years from January 2025 to January 2029, after which constitutional referendum would determine permanent governmental structure. The agreement mandated political reconciliation, including amnesty for opposition figures and former regime officials, economic reconstruction prioritizing oil sector restoration and infrastructure rebuilding, and foreign policy balancing relations with multiple partners, including African nations, Arab nations, Russia, China, Turkey, and European nations willing to engage constructively. The agreement's most important provision from strategic perspective committed unified Libya to joining Alliance of Sahel states and signing Sahel-Libya Defense Pact within 12 months of government formation, fulfilling the commitment Saif al-Islam made to me in September 2024. Western governments immediately denounced Benghazi Agreement as illegitimate and called for UN-mediated process instead. But Libyan factions ignored Western demands because UN-mediated processes had failed repeatedly from 2011 to 2024, while African-mediated process succeeded in 6 days. On January 15, 2025, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi was inaugurated as President of Unified Libya in ceremony attended by leaders from 28 African nations, Russia, China, Turkey, and Arab League members, but notably boycotted by United States, France, Britain, Germany, and other NATO members who refused to legitimize Gaddafi family's return. From January to December 2025, Saif al-Islam's government consolidated control over Libyan territory, restored oil production from 600,000 barrels daily in 2024 to 1.1 million barrels daily in November 2025, approaching pre-2011 levels of 1.6 million barrels daily, rebuilt infrastructure including electricity grids and water systems, restored basic government services including healthcare and education, and re-established security through unified military command integrating former rival militias. Libya's economic recovery exceeded expectations, with GDP growing from $18 billion in 2024 to projected $42 billion in 2025, 134% growth in 1 year, driven by restored oil production, Chinese infrastructure investments totaling $8.4 billion, and return of stability enabling commerce. Popular support for Saif al-Islam's government reached 68% in November 2025 polling, demonstrating majority Libyans believed reunification under Gaddafi family delivered better governance than 14 years of Western-backed alternatives. This brings us to December 12, 2025, when Saif al-Islam and I signed Sahel-Libya Defense Pact in Tripoli, fulfilling the commitment made 15 months earlier and creating military alliance that fundamentally threatens NATO's Mediterranean dominance in ways NATO cannot effectively counter. Let me explain exactly what this pact establishes and why NATO's panicked response reveals they understand they've lost strategic position they held for 80 years since World War II. The Sahel-Libya Defense Pact establishes integrated military command structure coordinating alliance of Sahel states forces, 840,000 active troops across 8 nations, with Libya's reconstituted armed forces, 120,000 active troops rebuilt from militias integrated under unified command. This creates combined force of 960,000 troops under coordinated strategic planning, joint training exercises, shared intelligence, and unified operational doctrine. The pact doesn't create single army replacing national militaries. It creates coordination frameworks similar to NATO's structure, where national forces maintain domestic responsibilities while contributing to collective defense when required. But unlike NATO, which depends on American leadership and American military dominance, Sahel-Libya alliance operates on genuinely equal basis, with rotating command responsibilities and decisions requiring consensus rather than American veto. The pact establishes mutual defense obligations requiring all 9 member states to treat armed attack against any member as armed attack against all members, triggering automatic military response from entire alliance without requiring additional consensus votes or deliberations. This mutual defense provision makes NATO military intervention against any alliance member practically impossible without triggering war with entire alliance. If NATO attempted to intervene in Libya as they did in 2011, they'd automatically be at war with Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Chad, Guinea, Mauritania, Togo, plus Russia and potentially China through their security partnerships with alliance members. NATO will not risk that escalation, meaning NATO military option for reversing Gaddafi family's return is permanently foreclosed. The pact provides alliance members guaranteed access to Libya's 4 major Mediterranean ports, Tripoli, Benghazi, Tobruk, and Misrata, for commercial trade and naval operations, permanently solving the landlocked problem that has economically strangled Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Chad since independence. For 65 years, these 4 Sahel nations have been imprisoned by brutal geography. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Chad possess zero ocean access. Every single export, gold, uranium, cotton, livestock, agricultural products, had to transit through coastal nations that Western powers could manipulate, pressure, or bribe into restricting our trade whenever we defied Western interests. Let me show you the catastrophic economic costs this geographic curse imposed on Sahel nations. Every export traveled 200 kilometers through Côte d'Ivoire to Abidjan port, or 100 kilometers through Ghana to Tema port, or 980 kilometers through Togo to Lomé port. Each route required crossing one international border, paying customs fees averaging 8.4% of cargo value, paying transit fees averaging $420 per container, enduring bureaucratic delays averaging 6 days per shipment, and accepting vulnerability to political pressure where coastal governments could restrict access whenever France or USA demanded it. Exports traveled 1,340 kilometers through Senegal to Dakar port, or 180 kilometers through Côte d'Ivoire to Abidjan. Mali's route dependence became a weapon against us. When we expelled French forces in 2022 and embraced Russian partnership, France pressured Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire to delay Malian cargo inspections, adding 12-18 days to shipping times and costing Malian exporters $84 million in missed delivery contracts during 2023 alone. Uranium exports. Niger produces 5.4% of global uranium, powering French nuclear reactors, generating 70% of France's electricity, traveled 1,950 kilometers through Benin to Cotonou port. When Niger's military government expelled French ambassador and terminated French military presence in 2023, France orchestrated Benin's temporary closure of Niger cargo transit for security inspections, blocking $340 million in Niger exports for 47 days until international pressure forced reopening. Oil exports traveled 1,070 kilometers through Cameroon via the Chad-Cameroon pipeline to Kribi port, a pipeline built and controlled by ExxonMobil and Chevron, giving American oil companies effective veto over Chad's primary revenue source, representing 68% of government budget. This landlocked dependence wasn't accidental geography, it was deliberate colonial design. European powers drew African borders specifically to create landlocked nations dependent on coastal colonies, ensuring post-independence African nations would remain economically controllable even after political independence. France's Jacques Foccart, architect of France-Afrique neo-colonial system, explicitly stated in 1961, landlocked francophone nations will never achieve true sovereignty because we control their neighbors who control their trade routes. For 65 years, he was right, until December 12, 2025, at 10:39 a.m., when Saif al-Islam Gaddafi and I signed the pact ending this geographic imprisonment forever. With guaranteed Mediterranean access through Libya, alliance members can now export directly to European, Asian, and Middle Eastern markets without depending on potentially hostile coastal nations that Western powers could pressure to restrict alliance trade. Let me show you the revolutionary trade route transformations this creates. Gold exports now travel 2,400 kilometers north through Niger and southern Libya to Tripoli port. One international border, Niger, 0 hostile governments, 8 days average transit time, $280 per container transit fees, 33% cheaper than coastal routes, and complete immunity to French pressure because Russia's S-400 air defense systems make NATO intervention militarily suicidal. From Tripoli, Burkina Faso gold reaches Marseille in 4 days, versus 9 days from Abidjan, reaches Istanbul in 3 days, reaches Alexandria in 2 days, and reaches Dubai in 6 days. Our exporters save $1,840 per container in reduced transit costs and 4.2 days in reduced shipping time, translating to $340 million annual savings across Burkina Faso's $4.2 billion export economy. Cotton exports. Mali produces 840,000 tons annually, Africa's second largest production, now travel 2,850 kilometers northeast through Algeria, our ally since Algeria joined African Unity Accord in October 2025, to Libya's Tobruk port. Transit time, 9 days versus 12 days through Dakar. Transit costs, $380 per container versus $520 through Senegal. Annual savings, $180 million across Mali's $2.8 billion agricultural export sector. From Tobruk, Malian cotton reaches Genoa in 5 days, reaches Piraeus in 3 days, reaches Izmir in 3 days, positioning Mali to capture increased market share in European and Middle Eastern textile industries worth $840 billion annually. Uranium exports, 5,400 tons annually worth $840 million, now travel 1,080 kilometers north through southern Libya to Benghazi port, cutting 170 kilometers and 3 days off the Benin route. More importantly, this route eliminates French leverage over Niger's uranium trade. France can no longer threaten transit disruptions to punish Niger for independence, because Russian military presence in Libya makes French interference impossible without triggering military confrontation. France absolutely cannot win. Oil exports now have alternative to the American-controlled Chad-Cameroon pipeline. New pipeline under construction from Chad's Doba oil fields through southern Libya to Tobruk port, financed by $2.8 billion Chinese investment with 2.1% interest rates versus World Bank's 6.4% rates. Completion projected October 2027. This pipeline will transport 180,000 barrels per day, generating $3.6 billion annual revenue at $60 per barrel average, with 100% controlled by Chad government and Chinese partners, zero American veto power. This Mediterranean access doesn't just reduce shipping costs, it fundamentally transforms the alliance of Sahel states from a landlocked regional bloc into a continental power with direct access to global commerce, fundamentally shifting our economic viability and strategic importance in ways Western powers cannot reverse. Consider the geopolitical mathematics. Before the pact, the alliance of Sahel states represented 8 nations with 94 million people, 184 billion combined GDP, and complete vulnerability to Western economic pressure through coastal nation manipulation. After the pact, we represent 9 nations, including Libya's 6.8 million people, with 101 million people, $226 billion combined GDP, $42 billion added from Libya's restored oil economy, and guaranteed Mediterranean access that renders Western economic pressure impotent. But the transformation extends far beyond Sahel nations. Every landlocked African nation is now watching and calculating. If Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Chad solve their ocean access problem through Sahel-Libya alliance, why can't we? Central African Republic, 4.8 million people, completely landlocked, surrounded by unstable neighbors, already in negotiations to join alliance, gaining Mediterranean access through Libya, replacing current dependence on Cameroon's Douala port, 450 kilometers away. South Sudan, 11 million people, landlocked since 2011 independence, currently depends on Kenya's Mombasa port, 840 kilometers away. Expressed interest in alliance membership, particularly attracted by Russian security guarantees protecting against Sudanese aggression. Zimbabwe, 15 million people, landlocked, currently depends on South African ports controlled by government maintaining relations with Western powers. Exploring alliance associate membership, seeking alternative to routes through South Africa that USA could pressure closed if Zimbabwe deepens Chinese partnership. Zambia, 18 million people, landlocked, surrounded by 8 neighbors, calculating whether Alliance Mediterranean access offers better trade economics than current routes through Tanzania's Dar es Salaam port. If even half these nations join the alliance by 2027, and current momentum suggests they will represent 15 African nations with 164 million people and $420 billion combined GDP, making us the largest political economic bloc in Africa, exceeding even the economic community of West African states that France has manipulated for 65 years. And every single member will have guaranteed Mediterranean access through Libya, immunizing all of us against Western economic coercion forever. The pact commits Russia to positioning military advisors, air defense systems, and naval assets across Libya and potentially the Sahel, supporting alliance defense against Western military intervention. As of December 14, 2025, just 2 days after the pact signing, Russia has already deployed forces that make NATO intervention militarily impractical without accepting casualty levels NATO publics will never support. Let me detail exactly what Russia has positioned. S-400 Triumph air defense systems deployed to Tobruk Air Base and Benina International Airport near Benghazi, covering eastern Mediterranean approaches to Libya with engagement ranges of 400 kilometers against aircraft and 250 kilometers against cruise missiles. These systems create a protective bubble over eastern Libya, extending 400 kilometers into Mediterranean international waters, meaning NATO aircraft approaching Libyan airspace would enter S-400 engagement range while still 400 kilometers from Libyan coast, well outside visual range, in international airspace where NATO claims freedom of navigation. Russia positioned 6 S-400 battalions in eastern Libya. Each battalion operates 8 launchers with 32 missiles per launcher, totaling 48 launchers and 1,536 missiles across the eastern air defense network. At 92% kill probability per missile against 4th-generation fighters and 78% against 5th-generation stealth fighters, this eastern network could simultaneously engage 384 aircraft, more than NATO's entire Mediterranean air presence of 240 aircraft stationed across Italy, Greece, and Turkey. S-300 PMU-2 air defense systems deployed to Mitiga International Airport in Tripoli and Misrata Air Base, covering western Mediterranean approaches with 200-kilometer engagement range against aircraft and 150 kilometers against cruise missiles. Russia positioned 4 S-300 battalions totaling 32 launchers and 1,024 missiles, capable of simultaneously engaging 256 aircraft. Together, Eastern and Western air defense networks create overlapping coverage across Libya's entire 1,770-kilometer Mediterranean coastline, plus extended coverage 400 kilometers into international waters, plus coverage extending south into alliance territory protecting Niger, Mali, and Chad from potential French airstrikes launched from remaining French bases in Côte d'Ivoire or Gabon. 2,400 Russian military advisors positioned across Libya and alliance nations as of December 14, 2025, organized into specialized advisory teams, 840 advisors operating air defense systems, 480 advisors training alliance military forces in Russian weapon systems and tactics, 380 advisors operating electronic warfare systems, 280 advisors providing intelligence and reconnaissance support, 240 advisors training alliance special operations forces, and 180 advisors coordinating integrated command and control across alliance members. These aren't contractors or mercenaries, these are active-duty Russian military personnel operating under Russian military command, meaning NATO attacks on these forces would constitute attacks on Russian military triggering potential Russian military response. NATO learned from Syria that Russia will defend its military personnel with all necessary force, including strikes on attackers' bases and assets. Russia announced plans on December 13, 2025, to establish permanent naval facility in Tobruk supporting Russian Mediterranean fleet operations. Current Russian Mediterranean fleet consists of 15 surface combatants, 4 submarines, and 8 support vessels operating from Tartus, Syria, Russia's only Mediterranean naval base since Soviet era. Tobruk Naval Facility will provide Russia with second Mediterranean base 1,450 kilometers west of Tartus, dramatically expanding Russian ability to project naval power across entire Mediterranean basin. Planned Tobruk facilities include pier infrastructure supporting 8 surface combatants and 3 submarines simultaneously, maintenance facilities for ship repairs and resupply, fuel storage for 180,000 tons of ship fuel oil, ammunition storage for naval weapon systems, and barracks housing 2,400 naval personnel. Construction beginning February 2026, funded by $1.8 billion Russian investment with completion projected December 2027. Once operational, Russian Mediterranean fleet will operate from both Tartus and Tobruk, enabling one task force to operate in eastern Mediterranean, covering Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, Turkey, Greece, while second task force operates in central and western Mediterranean, covering Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Italy, France, Spain, doubling Russian naval presence and surveillance coverage. Russia deployed Krasuka-4 electronic warfare systems to Libya capable of jamming NATO aircraft radar, disrupting GPS navigation, and interfering with NATO satellite communications at ranges up to 300 kilometers. 4 Krasuka-4 systems positioned at Tobruk, Benghazi, Tripoli, and Saba create electronic warfare coverage across Libya and northern Sahel, degrading NATO's critical intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities that NATO depends on for targeting and battle damage assessment. During NATO's 2011 Libya intervention, NATO flew 26,500 sorties over 7 months, relying on complete air superiority and uncontested surveillance. With Russian air defense and electronic warfare systems now positioned across Libya, NATO would face contested airspace, degraded situational awareness, and aircraft losses potentially exceeding 40 aircraft in first week of operations, casualty levels politically unsustainable in USA, France, Britain, Germany, or Italy, where publics oppose military interventions in regions perceived as non-vital to national security. These Russian positions create what military strategists call anti-access area denial zones, geographic areas where adversary military operations become prohibitively costly due to layered defenses creating unacceptable attrition rates. Russian air defense systems prevent NATO from operating in Libyan airspace or Libyan territorial waters without risking aircraft and ship losses that NATO publics won't accept. Let me show you the operational mathematics that make NATO intervention impractical. To replicate 2011 intervention, NATO would need to establish air superiority over Libya, requiring suppression of enemy air defenses campaign destroying Russian S-400 and S-300 systems before conducting strike operations against Libyan government targets. Suppressing 10 Russian air defense battalions, 6 S-400, 4 S-300, would require approximately 480 strike sorties, delivering 1,120 anti-radiation missiles and precision-guided munitions. but these strikes would need to penetrate Russian air defense engagement zones where S-400 systems would engage NATO aircraft at 400-kilometer range, likely achieving 15 to 22% attrition rate based on Russian systems' demonstrated performance in Syria and Ukraine. 15% attrition across 480 sorties means 72 NATO aircraft shot down, exceeding total NATO aircraft losses across all conflicts since 1991, 68 aircraft lost in Gulf War, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya combined over 34 years. Losing 72 aircraft in first week of Libya campaign would create immediate political crisis across NATO capitals, with publics demanding explanation of why their governments are fighting costly war over African nation that poses zero threat to NATO security, and that's assuming Russia only defends passively. If Russia chose to retaliate against NATO bases in Italy, Greece, or Turkey used to launch strikes, escalation could spiral toward NATO-Russia direct conflict that nobody in Washington, Paris, London, Berlin, or Rome wants. Establishing Mediterranean naval blockade of Libya to cut Saif al-Islam's government from external support would require NATO naval vessels operating within 200 kilometers of Libyan coast, well within range of Russian coastal defense missile systems including K-300P Bastion P with 300-kilometer range anti-ship missiles. Russia positioned 3 Bastion P battalions along Libyan coast, Tobruk, Benghazi, Tripoli, with 36 launchers total, capable of launching 72 anti-ship missiles in single salvo. These missiles travel at Mach 2.5, use sea-skimming flight profiles making them difficult to detect and intercept, and carry 250-kilogram warheads sufficient to mission-kill destroyers or sink frigates with single hit. NATO's Mediterranean naval presence consists of approximately 18 surface combatants on routine deployment. Losing even 2 to 3 vessels to Russian anti-ship missiles would represent catastrophic loss, requiring immediate operational pause, political consultations, and likely withdrawal given absence of vital national interests, justifying continued losses. NATO could eventually overwhelm Russian defenses if willing to accept heavy casualties over extended campaign lasting months and costing hundreds of aircraft, dozens of ships, and thousands of personnel. But NATO lacks political will for costly war over influence in region they already lost. NATO publics won't support major military campaign in Africa when NATO faces more pressing challenges. Ukraine support consuming $180 billion since 2022, China tensions over Taiwan requiring focus on Indo-Pacific, and domestic economic concerns including inflation, energy costs, and social spending demanding budgetary priority over African interventions. Russia's military presence in Libya doesn't make NATO intervention impossible. It makes intervention politically impossible by raising costs beyond what NATO democracies will pay for non-vital interests. And that political impossibility gives alliance of Sahel states and Libya complete strategic freedom to build our Pan-African systems without fear of Western military interference. The pact coordinates members' foreign policies advancing Pan-African interests, including opposing Western neo-colonial interference, supporting African Unity Accord implementation, promoting Afro-currency adoption, and presenting unified positions in international forums. This diplomatic coordination transforms African influence in global institutions where Western powers previously exploited African divisions to maintain control. The alliance of Sahel states plus Libya represents 9 votes in the 193-member UN General Assembly, combined with the 54 nations of the African Unity Accord representing 28% of total votes. We form largest unified voting bloc in UN history, exceeding even the Cold War-era non-aligned movement's 120 members who rarely voted cohesively. When African Unity Accord members vote together, we can block any UN General Assembly resolution requiring 2/3 majority, 128 votes. Western powers need 74 non-African votes to reach 128 vote threshold, but with China, Russia, and many Asian and Latin American nations supporting African positions, Western powers can no longer pass resolutions condemning African governments or endorsing interventions without African consent. While Western powers, USA, France, Britain, hold permanent seats with veto power, our unified bloc can pressure Security Council through 3 mechanisms. First, we can paralyze UN peacekeeping operations by withdrawing African troop contributions. African nations provide 47% of UN's 87,000 peacekeepers deployed globally, meaning our withdrawal would collapse UN peacekeeping system, forcing Security Council to either negotiate with African bloc or watch UN peace operations fail across conflict zones in Mali, Central African Republic, South Sudan, and Democratic Republic of Congo. Second, we can demand Security Council reform as condition for continued UN cooperation. Our unified position supports creating 2 permanent African seats with veto power, and we've announced we'll pursue this through UN Charter amendment process requiring support of 2/3 of member states. With 54 African votes plus support from China, Russia, India, Brazil, and many Asian and Latin American nations, we're approaching the 129 votes needed for charter amendment. Third, we can establish alternative frameworks bypassing Security Council entirely. Alliance's success resolving Libya reunification, Sudan civil war, and Eastern DRC conflict without UN involvement proves African-led mechanisms can achieve peace and stability more effectively than Western-dominated UN processes, undermining UN Security Council's claim to monopoly on legitimate international intervention. Unified African Bloc is demanding fundamental reform of IMF World Bank governance, where Western nations control decision-making despite representing minority of global population and decreasing share of global economy. Current IMF voting shares, USA 16.5%, European Union members combined 26.4%, total Western control 42.9%, sufficient to block any major decision requiring 85% approval. African nations collectively hold 7.2% voting share, despite representing 18% of global population and 12% of developing world economy. We're demanding African voting share increase to minimum 18%, matching our population share, financed by proportional reductions in overrepresented Western shares, and we're demanding removal of IMF World Bank loan conditionalities requiring borrower nations to implement austerity, privatization, and market liberalization policies that benefited Western corporations while impoverishing African populations. If Western powers refuse reform, Unified African Bloc will increasingly bypass IMF World Bank entirely, using African prosperity banks, Chinese development financing, and Afro-currency systems as alternatives, rendering Western financial institutions irrelevant to African development. Unified Bloc is demanding WTO reform, ending agricultural subsidies that allow Western farmers to export products below production cost, destroying African farmers' livelihoods. USA provides $40 billion annually in agricultural subsidies. EU provides $65 billion, allowing American and European farmers to dump wheat, corn, rice, cotton, and dairy products in African markets at prices African farmers cannot match. This subsidy system destroyed African agricultural sectors over 30 years. African agricultural production declined from 28% of African GDP in 1990 to 16% in 2024, while food imports increased from $18 billion to $84 billion annually, creating permanent dependency and vulnerability to Western pressure. Unified African Bloc demands immediate elimination of Western agricultural subsidies or authorization for equivalent African subsidies. If Western powers claim subsidies are necessary to protect their farmers, African nations have equal right to protect ours. If WTO refuses, we'll implement regional agricultural protection regardless of WTO rules, daring Western powers to enforce compliance through trade sanctions that would devastate Western economies now dependent on African mineral resources, energy supplies, and consumer markets worth $2.8 trillion annually. For 65 years, Western powers maintained African control through divide and conquer, exploiting ethnic tensions, bribing individual leaders, supporting coups against independent-minded governments, and ensuring African nations competed rather than cooperated. The Sahel-Libya Sovereignty Pact renders these tactics obsolete through 3 mechanisms Western powers cannot counter. Attack on any alliance member triggers collective response from all members, meaning France cannot bomb Burkina Faso without facing military response from Mali, Niger, Chad, Libya, and Russian forces positioned across alliance territory. This collective defense erases military superiority that allowed France to intervene unilaterally in African nations 67 times since 1960. Guaranteed Mediterranean access, Afro-currency adoption, and coordinated trade policies create mutual prosperity, where each member's success depends on alliance cohesion, giving every member strong incentive to resist Western attempts to peel off individual nations through bribes or threats. Russia's military presence and commitment to alliance defense means Western intervention risks NATO-Russia confrontation, raising costs beyond any conceivable benefit from restoring Western control over Sahel or Libya. Western intelligence agencies will attempt to fracture the alliance through coups, assassinations, and separatist movements. They're already trying, but they're failing because we learned from 65 years of Western subversion and built countermeasures. We built the Alliance Intelligence Coordination Center in Ouagadougou in August 2025 specifically to defeat Western divide-and-conquer tactics that destroyed African unity attempts for 65 years. This center operates 24 hours daily with 340 intelligence officers from all 9 alliance members, plus Russian and Chinese advisors, monitoring Western destabilization operations across our territory in real time. We intercept communications between CIA station chiefs and potential coup plotters, track financial transfers from French intelligence to separatist movements, identify Western NGOs serving as intelligence fronts, and coordinate rapid response operations, neutralizing threats before execution. The results prove our system works. We've already disrupted 14 Western-backed coup plots in 8 months since the center became operational. In Burkina Faso, we arrested 47 military officers planning a French-backed coup scheduled for October 2025, seizing encrypted communications, providing direct coordination with French military intelligence officers in Abidjan. In Mali, we intercepted an $8.4 million CIA transfer to Tuareg separatist leadership planning to declare independent Azawad state in northern Mali, arrested 84 conspirators, and published banking records showing funds originated from U.S. State Department democracy promotion accounts. In Niger, we exposed German BND intelligence operation recruiting university students to organize protests demanding return to civilian rule, arrested 12 BND assets, and expelled 5 German diplomats providing operational guidance. In Chad, we disrupted assassination plot against president using poison manufactured in French laboratory, arrested 6 conspirators including 2 French nationals, and published their operational communications showing orders from Paris. We arrested 340 Western intelligence operatives total, 127 African nationals recruited as assets, 89 Western nationals operating under diplomatic or NGO cover, 78 mercenaries contracted for coup operations, and 46 corporate executives facilitating financial transfers. We published their communications exposing Western intelligence involvement in comprehensive documentation totaling 2,040 pages, now available on Alliance Intelligence Coordination Center public website in French, English, Arabic, and major African languages, proving beyond any doubt that France, USA, Britain, and Germany are actively attempting to overthrow our governments despite public claims they respect African sovereignty. Western intelligence agencies responded with fury, condemning our fabricated evidence and demanding release of their arrested officers. We refused. 14 operatives now await trial in Ouagadougou under Alliance anti-subversion laws, carrying sentences up to life imprisonment for espionage against Alliance member states. Their trials begin February 2026 with full public proceedings broadcast internationally, ensuring the world sees documented proof of Western neo-colonial interference operations. Your divide and conquer strategy that worked flawlessly for 65 years is finished forever because we fundamentally transformed how African nations share intelligence and coordinate security responses. We're unified through binding intelligence sharing protocols where every alliance member receives real-time threat information within minutes of detection. When our signals intelligence intercepts suspicious communication between CIA officer in Accra and military contact in Niamey, that intercept appears simultaneously on secure terminals in Ouagadougou, Bamako, Niamey, N'Djamena, Tripoli, Dakar, Conakry, and Nouakchott intelligence centers within 4 minutes. When our financial intelligence tracks unusual transactions from German bank accounts to opposition figures in Burkina Faso, all 9 alliance members receive alerts with full transaction details, source account information, and recipient identification, enabling coordinated investigation across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. We're coordinated through integrated counterintelligence operations where alliance security forces conduct joint arrests across multiple nations simultaneously, preventing conspirators from fleeing to neighboring countries like they did for 65 years when African governments operated in isolation. When we identified the French-backed coup plot in Burkina Faso scheduled for October 2025, we didn't just arrest the 47 conspirators in Ouagadougou, we simultaneously arrested their 23 external support contacts in Abidjan, their 8 financial facilitators in Dakar, their 12 logistics coordinators in Lomé, and their 6 exfiltration support team in Accra. Total 96 arrests executed within 40 minutes across 5 nations, completely dismantling the entire conspiracy network before anyone could escape or destroy evidence. This coordinated capability makes Western coup operations impossibly difficult because conspirators can no longer assume they'll find safe haven in neighboring countries. Every alliance member will arrest them on site based on shared intelligence and mutual legal assistance treaties we signed in September 2025. We're learning from each other how to defeat every tactic you've used against us for 65 years, sharing detailed analysis of Western operational methods, comparing patterns across different operations, and developing specific countermeasures for each technique. We've reverse-engineered the coup playbook France used in 67 interventions since 1960, documenting the standard six-phase model: identification and recruitment of military officers with personal grievances, provision of encrypted communications equipment, transfer of operational funding through diplomatic pouches, coordination of international media preparation, positioning of Western military forces for rapid intervention supporting coup leaders, and immediate diplomatic recognition of new government. Now that we understand this playbook, we monitor each phase, screening military officers for Western recruitment approaches, detecting encrypted communications equipment, tracking financial transfers, monitoring international media for pre-positioned narratives, and watching Western military deployments near our borders. We've documented the assassination manual CIA used eliminating 40-plus African leaders since 1961, identifying standard methods: poison delivered through trusted household staff, staged vehicle accidents on remote roads, sniper attacks blamed on opposition militants, and induced heart attacks using undetectable chemical agents. We've implemented comprehensive protective security protocols defeating each method: presidential food prepared by rotating teams with real-time medical monitoring, vehicle convoys with multiple decoy vehicles and aerial surveillance, residential compounds with 360-degree sensor coverage, and advanced medical screening detecting chemical agents in presidential blood work. We've analyzed the separatist insurgency model France deployed in northern Mali, eastern DRC, and Casamance region, recognizing the pattern: identification of ethnic or regional grievances, external financing and weapons supply to militant groups, international media amplification of separatist narratives, and diplomatic pressure for negotiated settlements granting autonomy leading to eventual independence. We've countered this with economic development specifically targeting potentially separatist regions, intelligence penetration of militant groups identifying external supporters, and public exposure of Western backing destroying separatists' local legitimacy. We've studied the color revolution framework USA used in Eastern Europe, Arab Spring, and attempted in African nations, understanding the standardized regime change methodology, funding opposition civil society organizations, training youth activists in protest tactics, coordinating mass demonstrations, triggering security crackdowns, amplifying police violence through social media, and leveraging international condemnation to delegitimize governments. We've responded with comprehensive civic education programs exposing Western funding of opposition groups, legal restrictions on foreign funding of political activities, and measured security responses avoiding the provocations Western operations depend on. You cannot split us anymore because we've studied your methods obsessively, identified your patterns with precision, and built systems specifically designed to neutralize your operations before execution. The Sahel-Libya alliance is permanent and irreversible, protected by intelligence capabilities you cannot penetrate using encryption systems your NSA cannot break, military force you cannot defeat without accepting casualties your publics won't support, and political unity you cannot fracture because we've immunized ourselves against every division tactic you've ever used. And it's just the beginning of Pan-African unity that will end Western control over our continent forever. This model is already spreading to East Africa, Southern Africa, and Central Africa, where 28 additional nations are studying our intelligence coordination systems, our counterintelligence methodologies, and our unified diplomatic strategies, preparing to join continental security architecture that will make Western interference in Africa completely impossible by 2027.